Alrighty. So it looks like we have reached 10 o'clock, which is my cue to maybe get started here. So welcome today to our session, executive session specifically presented by Eileen Eakins. In regards to questions throughout today's presentation, we're going to do a new format. Eileen will every once in a while take a break in between her slides and call for questions. In the case of that, please do unmute yourself, or if you would like, you can type it in the chat down below. But if you want to unmute yourself or then come on camera, please ask questions then. If you also want to use the raise hand feature, which can be found at the top of your Teams program, please use that. It will indicate that you have a question, and we can go in the order of the questions that come in. So if you do have questions, please use that feature. But with that, I'd like to pass it on over to Eileen Eakins for today's presentation.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome. I'm Eileen Eakins. I'm an attorney. I am an attorney with the Northwest Local Government Legal Advisors, LLC, and my contact information is on that first slide, which I hope you can all see. First of all, this is, as you know, is a reprise of the session that was supposed to be offered at the annual conference. And if you tried to attend that one, I apologize. We had technical issues. I still have no idea what happened. I was lecturing my little heart out. I didn't even realize we were stopping recording until I got to about an hour in, and I asked for questions, and it was complete silence. And I said, hello, 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 and nobody answered. And then I realized no one was there. So, and the SDAO staff were emailing me, but I did not get the emails because I was busy giving a class. So apologies to those of you who tried, and those of you who are trying again, thank you very much. Hopefully this one will go much smoother. I'm anxious about this one, but Jennifer has walked me through it, and my hope is that this will go much more smoothly. So thank you all for coming on a Friday morning. The session is scheduled to last about 90 minutes. The first hour or so is content. And as Christian said, I welcome your questions as we go. There will be kind of some natural breaks in the presentation where I'll invite your questions, and you're welcome to, as Christian said, unmute yourself and let me know. It's possible that your question will be something I'm going to be talking about later on in the presentation, and then I'll just, kind of put you off a bit. And then the final part of this, which I think will be kind of fun, is we'll do a little sort of application in real life, some role-playing scenarios for executive sessions. The content piece of this, if you attended or have attended the full day board training, board obligations and responsibilities session that I teach along with George Dunkel, this is the content for this is pretty much the same as what you get in that in our public meetings section, but this one is specifically about executive sessions. Because in my experience with public meetings, that is probably the thing that most districts have the most questions about, and where, frankly, violations of public meetings law are most likely to happen. So the fact that you guys are here learning this means that you are much less likely to violate the law, which I appreciate. I'm going to go ahead and get started. That you should be able to follow along in the slides. I'll be speaking to the slides as we go. If you have technical issues at all, please unmute and let us know. I can't do anything about it, but the brain trust at SDAO will be able to handle that. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and get started. So we always start with a definition. What do we mean by executive session? I don't know how many of you are brand new to public meetings and how many of you have been doing this forever. So I have to kind of speak to the medium, to the middle here. So some of this stuff may be pretty basic, but it always helps to review it. If you are brand new to public meetings, hopefully this will at least give you some nomenclature so you get oriented into the kinds of things we're talking about. This definition comes out of the statute. If you're interested in looking up statutes, the statutory sites are on most of these slides, but this is the definition of executive session under Oregon law. Any meeting or part of a meeting of a governing body which is closed to certain persons for deliberation on certain matters. So executive sessions are referred to in the case law as a privilege, meaning that Oregon highly favors transparency. It highly favors public meetings, highly favors allowing people to attend a public meeting and listen to what's being said. Executive sessions are considered a privilege because you are essentially telling the public that they are not allowed to hear what you're saying and they don't get to participate. So there are very prescribed ways that board members, governing boards could go into executive session. When you have an executive session, no votes are allowed. You can talk about it until you all decide how you want to vote. You could even reach consensus if you want to, but there is no final voting. That final votes must always be taken in open session in order to bind the district to anything. So essentially, executive sessions are there for you to have a confidential conversation about whatever subject matter you want to talk about. I have somebody. Jennifer, did you see the comment, or Christian, that the someone is not seeing the slides?
Yes, I'm looking into it now. I do see the slides on my end. Let me see if I can help Kelly.
Okay. And I'm going to hope that, yeah, others are saying they can see them. So hopefully that's kind of a unique communication issue with specific computers. So we'll keep working on that. And we're getting multiple things that some say I don't see them, some say I can see them. Is there, Kristen, do you think there's enough people that we should stop, or should I just press forward?
I believe you're.
Just go ahead and move forward. Sorry, Christian, to interrupt.
No, yeah.
Okay. So no final votes in executive session. No executive session may be held for the purpose of taking any final action or making any final decision. Who can attend an executive session? The board, the governing board, are the ones who are supposed to be attending the executive session. Ordinarily, there are very rare instances when a board member might recuse him or herself from the executive session, usually if there's a conflict of interest. But for most purposes, the board of directors attends the executive session, and then anyone that the board of directors would like to attend. And that usually falls on the board chair to decide who is appropriate to attend this session. And it might be, typically it's the district manager or the fire chief or whoever your CEO is. That's pretty typical that they attend, and usually somebody to take minutes. They're usually allowed to attend. And then for any executive session, with very rare exceptions, any members of the media who are present must be allowed to attend. So when you send out your meeting notice, one of the things that you're doing is notifying the media. We'll talk about notice in a minute. You are notifying the media that you are having a session, and then the media are there. They're not allowed to report on what is discussed in a properly called executive session. That's going to be important, and I'll explain why in a minute. If it's a properly called executive session, the media is not allowed to report on what's being discussed. And I frequently at this point get questions in the live show about what do we do if they do, or how, why are they even there? And the media in this context are there at basically as in a healthy democracy. The media are there as kind of proxy for the public. They are watchdogs of government, if you will. And they're there in kind of an accountability role where they participate and they're witnesses to what happens there. They can report if you're doing it illegally. So that's why it's going to be important that you do it legally. So any member of the media who wants to attend, in most cases, must be allowed to attend. If you get to the point where you have so many representatives of media there are steps you can take to limit who attends. If you have multiple members of the media wanting to attend your executive session, it usually means that you are in deep doo-doo, at which point you should be getting legal advice anyway. But as a general rule, these are the people who attend an executive session. The board can also decide, the attorney can attend, or, whomever else you want to participate in. All right. We're going to talk about when one can call an executive session. I saw that a question came up, so and it came up in the chat. Can someone either read that to me, or does that person just want to unmute and ask the question?
I can read it if they would like. It was a question from Shannon. Can the general manager determine who can be present, or is it ultimately at the board chair's discretion?
It's the board, it is up to the board chair. The general manager doesn't get to make that call. Remember, an executive session is a meeting of the board, so it falls to the board to decide. Now, certainly the general manager can advise, can recommend, can suggest in a healthy if the board and the CEO are in a good relationship, they're going to rely on the CEO to do that. But ultimately, it's going to be the board's call. The board, and it falls to the board chair to do that. Okay, see if I can do this without losing you. There we go. Okay, can the board call an executive session whenever it chooses? At this point, I will usually poll the audience. I won't do that here in the interest of time, but it is very common, more common than it should be for both staff and board members to assume that an executive session can be called by the board whenever the board thinks it's a really good idea. Or when, this is going to be an embarrassing thing. So why would we discuss it publicly? Or, we have something we just really would like to keep confidential for now. So we're going to meet an executive session. I can tell you that the board does not have the discretion to just call an executive session just because you want to. There are specific reasons when you can go into executive session. I'm going to walk through those with you. But it ultimately is it has to be a properly authorized executive session, and the authorization is going to come from statute. When you look at the statutory, what the statutes say, though, that ORS, if you don't know, refers to Oregon Revised Statutes. So these are Oregon laws that are written down in our legal code. This is what it says, and it's interesting because it says the same thing in two different ways. What the statute says is all meetings of the governing body of a public body shall be open to the public and all persons shall be permitted to attend any meeting. And then it says, except as otherwise provided, and it gives you a range of statutes, 192, 610 to 690. The following subparagraph says a quorum of a governing body may not meet in private for the purpose of deciding on or deliberating toward a decision on any matter except as otherwise provided by, and then you have that same range of statutory authorities. So what that says in I'm sorry, I keep getting interrupted by email notifications, which I don't have the time to figure out how to turn off. So my apologies if I get a little distracted. What this says in two different ways is that you can't meet in public unless you can't meet in private unless you have statutory authority. Furthermore, you can't hold public meetings in private unless you have statutory authority, and then it gives you that range of authority that's available to you to meet in executive session. Okay, we're going to talk, let me stop there because I saw a question come in about the media. Do you want to ask that question?
I can take it. Brad, it's from Brad. Can the media record audio executive session beyond taking notes?
Yes, there's nothing to prevent them from doing that. Generally speaking, in my experience, first of all, I want to just say that because we're in an era where many people are inclined to not trust the media. In my experience, journalists who are trained and are aware of their own ethics, they know what these laws are. They don't tend to run off and report on things that they're not supposed to report on. If they're not reporting on it, they might not have any motive to record it, but legally speaking, there's no reason why they can't. The issue is really, what do they do with the recording? I mean, can they, if they can't report on the thing, they might just keep the recording just because it's, in case it comes up later. But legally speaking, yes, they can record it. Okay. An executive session is a public meeting under the public meetings laws. Okay, it's considered a public meeting. The difference is it's a public meeting, must comply with all public meeting requirements. The difference is that the conversation is being held confidentially amongst the board. So you must give notice as you would for any other public meeting. You the same timeframes apply. The general standard is, general notice to the public at large and specific notice to specifically interested people, which is the media and anyone else who wants to be notified. And this is just notice. And we're going to talk about what should be in your notice next. But yes, you must send out your notice for executive sessions the way that you would for any other public meeting. And typically what you'll see is that, the public meeting notice will give is that a properly drafted public meeting notice is supposed to include an agenda of what you intend to talk about. And typically the agenda will reflect, an executive session on the agenda, and then it will give the statutory authority for the executive session, which leads me to the next sentence there, which is when you give a notice for an executive session, one, it has to be properly authorized, which means you have to have statutory authority to meet an executive session, and your meeting notice should state what that statutory authority is. There are these slides will sort of give you what the references are, but these can be looked up. They're available if you have a copy of or can go online and see the Attorney General's Public Records and Meetings Manual. It will list what the executive session authorities are. There are not a lot of them. I'm going to walk through them shortly. So a properly drafted executive session notice is going to include the statutory authority for the executive session. And then the completion of that notification ideally is that the board chair, when he or she convenes the executive session, it'll usually be something like the board will now go into executive session under the authority of, and then you'll cite whatever the statute is. When the executive session is convened, and you'll usually say the public is now excused, our attorney and the media are invited to attend, and we will reconvene with any final decisions at our next meeting. Or you're going to basically have a little. I like districts that have a little script for the board chair that explains to them what the things that they're supposed to say. There is no specific script required under the law, other than you have to state the statutory authority for the meeting when you convene the meeting. Now, all of this is if you did everything correctly. You sent the notice out in advance. If you're having an executive session, your advance notice will state the statutory authority. And then the board chair will announce the statutory authority before the board goes into executive session, and then that gets recorded in the minutes. If you've done all of that, you've done everything you're required to do to give proper notice. Occasionally I'll get a question about, what if we don't have time? If something comes up really quickly and you don't have time to send out the notice to the newspaper, your typical advance notice, you are allowed to convene the executive session in an emergency or, close to an emergency without sending the notice out in advance, as long as the board chair announces the executive session authority before convening the executive session. That can be enough, but you have to be very careful that the situation allows for that. So don't get in the habit of saying, oh, what the heck, we don't have to send out meeting notices, because you do. Because not sending the meeting notice habitually means that you are habitually violating the law. But at minimum, you have to announce it for the minutes so that it gets recorded in the minutes. Okay, I think I saw a question come up, which we might be addressing shortly. Whoops. Well, let me just address it now because the slides don't. I often see the agenda for the meeting, and it's usually in a template, which is typical and fine. And it'll have old business, new business, consent calendar, whatever the typical stuff is, and then the topics that the board intends to talk about. And then there'll be something at the bottom that says the board may go into executive session under any of the following authorities, and it lists them all off. First of all, there's nothing wrong with having that in your agenda. It can be a handy cheat sheet so that you can get the appropriate statutory authority for the board chair to refer to. The question, though, is that sufficient notice in advance for a specific executive session? In my opinion, it is not. If you know that you're going to go into executive session and you know the authority, that should be specifically stated in your agenda, not just kind of that catch-all thing at the end, but the specific for that specific meeting should be addressed in your agenda and part of your meeting notice. Okay, any questions about notice of executive sessions before we move on to other requirements? Okay, if you want to unmute, it's easier for me to just hear you say it, but Christian, if somebody doesn't want to say it, could you read whatever that question is?
Absolutely. We have a question from Marcy. Does a board member have to move to go into executive session with a move, second, and approval, or is it fine that the board chair state to the movement into executive session? The same question applies for moving out of executive session. Who authorizes leaving executive session, the board chair, or by move, second, and vote by board?
Well, first of all, any vote you take in executive session is not a binding vote, so you don't have to vote. And furthermore, if your agenda calls for an executive session, there's no reason for the board to vote to go into one. So yeah, under ordinary circumstances, if the executive session is in your meeting notice and your meeting notice explains what the authority is for your executive session, then the board, the board chair would handle it like they would any other item on the agenda. You talk about whatever you're going to talk about, and then the board chair would say, the next item on our agenda is that the board will go into executive session, and then you sort of launch into your little speech. So to answer the question, no, there's no need for the board to vote on that. The only time when, and I don't think it would come up often, but the time maybe when you might consider doing it that way is if during the course of your meeting, something comes up during the meeting that makes you have to immediately go into executive session, then you weren't prepared to do that. And there's some question about whether to have the executive session now or some other time. I could see that happening. If during the course of your meeting you discover that your district manager has just been arrested for embezzlement, and they come and take that person away during the executive session or during your meeting, that I could see you might want to convene an executive session right away to say, holy crap, we have to talk about this problem. You probably would not be doing it that way. So in most circumstances, I think the answer is no. You don't need a move or a second. And then the question about when you're in executive session, does there have to be, does a motion and a second to get out of executive session? No. Basically, you're going to talk about whatever you talk about, and the board, usually the board chair will say something like, are we done? And everybody will be like, yeah, we're done. And then you convene the regular session, maybe, and announce any final decisions, or you're done with the executive session and then it just ends. Okay, you must take minutes like you would for any other public meeting at an executive session. Again, as a procedural matter, this is not in the law, but as a procedural matter, and most districts I know do this when I've attended their executive sessions, you have a separate, if you're a tape recording, you will have a separate recording, like you'll have however you're recording it, one recording for the regular meeting, a separate recording for the executive session. Good idea to do that. It's a best practice approach, because what that does is ensure that whatever is confidential doesn't inadvertently get disclosed along with the stuff that isn't. Public meeting minutes are the most requested public record I think there is on the planet. So you're probably in the habit of disclosing public meeting records when people request them, and that's all very normal and fine. What you don't want to do is accidentally, because you had a confidential executive session during that meeting, accidentally disclose stuff you weren't supposed to disclose. So in terms of recording, keep separate recordings, or if you're taking notes by hand, which is also fine, have a file that is for executive session only and another file that's for the regular recorded minutes, and just make sure they stay separate. Yeah, and then because under most circumstances, the minutes from executive session, because the conversation you're having in executive session is by definition confidential, the minutes from that executive session are not, under most circumstances, disclosable as public records. If somebody were to come to you and say, I want a copy of the meeting minutes from your executive session, And then you say, you can say, no, we do not have to disclose those because they're a confidential public record. You would be correct. Again, that's for properly called executive sessions. Let me get through this slide and then I'll elaborate a little bit on that. Information discussed in an executive session is confidential to the board and anyone else who attends. So the idea being, and most board members do not need to be reminded of this, but it may be a good idea to get in the habit of reminding them before you go into executive session, that whatever is discussed in executive session is confidential for everybody. I don't see it happen. That was some weird feedback. I have seen it happen where board members are just so excited about whatever they just learned in executive session that they kind of want to run and tell their friends, or God forbid, tell the newspaper or something. But you basically blow that confidentiality for everybody if you do that. So it's important that the board understand that executive sessions, again, are a privilege. You should treat them the way that the law intends for you to treat them, which is this is confidential information for a reason. So keep it confidential. Same with anybody else who attends. The board should not be inviting people to attend that you do not believe can keep it confidential. And which is why limiting the number of people who attend is a good way to limit the number of people who have the confidential information. When we talk about disclosure of minutes, they are confidential public records, meaning, and they're one of the conditional exemptions, meaning that if the public interest in disclosing them outweighs the public interest in keeping them confidential, then they can be disclosed. It's not an outright prohibition. Ordinarily, you would not disclose them if somebody requested copies of them. They can be discovered, however, in a lawsuit. So they are part of discovery if the board or the district is sued based on something that was discussed in executive session, like a public meetings challenge. They can be, you will have to disclose them as part of discovery. And then the judge will decide whether they should be disclosed as part of the public record or not. So don't assume that just because you're in executive session that no one will ever know what you talk about, because they could. One thing I want to touch on is if you want the protections of both the confidentiality, the non-disclosure of public records piece of it, and if you want to make sure that the media understands that they are not allowed to report on what happens in executive session, it must be a properly called, properly authorized executive session, meaning that you have certain statutory authority to call it. I'm going to walk through those with you in a minute. You've properly called the executive session. You are only discussing in executive session that thing that you are authorized to talk about. And in that situation, those are the things that the media is not allowed to report on. It's important to recognize, however, that if you do while we're all here, here's this other thing I want us to talk about out of public earshot. That unless that other thing is also authorized by executive session authorization, that is fair game for the media, because what you have done there is morphed into an illegal executive session as it applies to that unauthorized topic. So be very careful when you go into executive session that you confine your conversation to the things you are authorized to talk about. It is possible, it would be kind of a messy situation, but it is possible that you could have more than one executive session authority. You want to talk about a couple of different things in executive session, and that's fine as long as each of those things has a statutory authority for that topic. Okay. Similarly, if you have a conversation in executive session which is not properly authorized, those minutes are not, you'll have a fight on your hands to try to keep those confidential, because if somebody finds out you talked about something in executive session that you weren't supposed to be, it will be very hard to claim the confidentiality under the public records law, and you may end up having to disclose them. So I'm going to talk about the specific authority to go into executive session in a minute. Any questions up till now on the stuff we just talked about?
Looks like we have a question from Barbara. Barbara, would you like to unmute? I can also read the question. So it's a question from Barbara. Our board approves the executive minutes in their board packet, so we don't put the details of the discussion in the minutes, and only the ORS citation for the reason for ES. Who was present and time. I keep separate notes for the file. Is this a problem? We record ES most of the time, but not always.
Everything you've described, good for you. I don't see a problem with any of that. I agree with you. And the reason why this is a protection for this kind of conversation under the public records law is I completely agree that it wouldn't make sense to have an executive session that is confidential and then blather away in your meeting minutes, your regular meeting minutes about what you talked about in executive session. So the fact that you're keeping them separate, good for you. That's excellent. The fact that you are, you don't have to record them as long as some kind of meetings minutes are being kept. They are both public records that have to be maintained for a specific amount of time. And just if in your the meeting minutes for the actual meeting, the public meeting, during which you have the executive session, that should just reference that the board went into executive session under the authority of, ORS 192-6602F to talk about public records exempt from disclosure. That's all you would put in your minutes, in your public minutes. The executive session minutes are going to have a little more detail because that's what minutes are for. But you are correct in that you should store them separately and make sure that they don't get inadvertently disclosed. But they should, however you take the minutes and make sure they reflect what was actually talked about. I have known clients who don't want to take minutes in their executive sessions because it's secret, and why would we take the risk that it be disclosed? I can tell you that if you need to defend yourselves, you, the board, need to defend yourselves from a claim that you are having illegal executive sessions and you are not taking minutes. Not taking minutes is a violation. Secondarily, you have no way to defend yourself that your conversation was properly authorized, so the presumption will be that it was not. So you need to have minutes of the executive session that summarize, you don't have to be play by play, but at least summarize the conversation that was held there. And it is not, I want you to resist the urge to try to keep everything secret, because as an attorney, I can tell you that the documentation that you will need to defend yourselves is very important. And that's kind of one of the things that you want to make sure you have, is the ability to defend yourselves quickly if somebody comes back and says you're doing this improperly. I hope that answers your question. Any other questions on that, Christian, that you're getting?
Yes, I have a couple here. One from Barb. If Barb, you would like to unmute, you can ask your question, or I can absolutely read it. I will read it. So from Barb, regular board meeting minutes are reviewed and approved by the board. Are we supposed to review and approve executive meeting minutes? How and when?
That's a good question. And I get that question fairly often, usually when I'm teaching this, in a live seminar. First of all, yes, that is correct, that your board should be approving your minutes, because basically what they're attesting to is that this is an accurate reflection of what was discussed during the meeting, during the minutes. The question about executive session minutes and whether they have to be approved, I understand that the trickiness there. My first response is if there is a tape recording of the executive session and that is your minutes, that doesn't need to be approved, because what are they going to say? I didn't really say that. If you have a recording of it, an actual physical recording, I don't think it needs approval at all. The question about whether but it is typical, not only are you taking notes, maybe you're taking written minutes, or what is often very common is that you will prepare from the recording. The staff will prepare a written summary of the recording. Very common, very practical to do it that way. So then the question in that situation is, let's say you have taken written minutes or you have prepared a transcript of the executive session conversation. It is a tricky question in that if you would like those to be approved, and there's no legal requirement that they be approved, but there might be a best practices argument that they should be. The way you would handle that legally would be to convene an executive session, and that because you have the authority to talk about public records exempt from disclosure, which is what the executive session meeting minutes are, is a confidential public record. You could have an executive session to review and decide whether to approve the executive session minutes. If you want to do completely by the book, that would be the way you would do that. And it could be done very quickly. You know, it's a simple enough thing to do. It could be done right before the meeting, right at the end of the meeting. Unless there's some, reason why they're horribly wrong. My guess is it could just be done administratively, but you can call an executive session to review and approve executive session minutes. Okay, I hope that helps. Okay. Let's talk about the reasons why one can go into executive session, and there are not a lot of them. And if they are not listed here, you do not have the authority. Okay, there is not whenever the board feels like it or whenever it seems like a really good idea. It's just not there. Okay, so be very careful. All right. Here is one. To consider the employment of a public officer, employee, staff member, or individual agent if. Now I'm going to get into the if in a minute. What this one is there for is if you want to be able to discuss the employment, usually because the board doesn't ordinarily get into staff hires, the board ordinarily is responsible for hiring the the CEO, the fire chief, the district manager, the executive director. That's usually what this is getting at. The board can convene an executive session to discuss the employment of that particular person or filling that particular position in executive session if you've jumped through a few hoops first. And these are the hoops, the bulleted sections there. You've advertised the vacancy, meaning this is not an internal hire. It might be an internal hire ultimately, but at least you have notified, you've put it out for applicants to apply. There are regular hiring procedures adopted, which basically means that you have a process in place. Like how do you go about hiring people? That could be in your employee manual. It could be something the board has discussed in advance. How are we going to hire this person? And part of that is a job description. You have a job description that's been approved. You're hiring to that job description, and this is the process we're going to use to interview people and fill that position. And in those situations, again, if it's an officer, that third bullet point, officer, which means management in this situation, like you're hiring an executive director, the public must have an opportunity to comment on both the job description and your hiring procedures. Doesn't mean you have to do what they say, but you have to basically have a public hearing that gives the public an opportunity to review and comment. And then the hiring criteria and procedures for filling the position are adopted in a public meeting, again, with that public comment. If you've done all of those things, then you can go into executive session to do quite a bit, actually. You can discuss, the individual candidates. You could even interview individual candidates. Not uncommon to see that happen. This is the authority you would use to do that. This is for filling that specific position, all right? And I'm going to tell you the limits of that in a minute. That authority does not apply if the position that you're filling is an elective office, like a vacancy on the board or a vacancy on the budget committee. There is no executive session authority at all to fill an elected position. The public policy argument being that the public gets to decide who fills an elected position. You don't get to decide that in executive session. So again, to the prior slide applies to you are filling usually a management position. Similarly, the second bullet point there, if you're filling a vacancy on any public committee, commission, or other advisory group, the board has an advisory committee and you need to talk about the people that are going to be filling a vacancy or staffing that advisory committee. That is not what that authority is getting at. It can be, and I actually have had clients push pretty hard on this. I see this happen most often when you want to fill a position on the budget committee or a vacancy on the board, and you have multiple candidates and who all know each other, and the board knows them all, and each board member has opinions on whether this person is good or bad, or, the board member may have an objection to those people, which is completely understandable, especially in a small community. And the board will ask me, can we, we don't want to discuss this publicly. We want to have a confidential conversation about these individual people. If it's the CEO, you can do that. If it's somebody who's appointed or elected to a committee, like the budget committee, or filling a vacancy on the board, all that ugly conversation has to be done in open session. Okay, so there just is no authority to do it that way. When I say do it that way, meaning talk about those positions in executive session. And then the final bullet point means that if you have not done these things in advance, you haven't gotten public input on the hiring, you haven't advertised the position, you haven't jumped through all those hoops, then you have to, if you're going to discuss that position, if the board is going to discuss that position, it must be done in an open session. There is no executive session authority to do that. Okay, so handy to use it in advance, a little bit of legwork in advance if you want to do it that way. If you don't want to do it that way, you don't have to, but just remember that that's what the executive session authority is for there. Okay. And this is another one. It's always a good idea to remember, be very, very careful with anything having to do with employment. I can tell you that under both the public meetings law and the public records law, employment stuff is always treated carefully, because under most circumstances, information about individual employees is kept confidential, and there's good reasons for that. This is another one that has to do with employment. There are two, that each bullet point is a separate authority, but they are similar. The first one is to consider the dismissal or disciplining of, or hear complaints or charges brought against a public officer, employee, staff member, or individual agent. That first one is about you want to discipline somebody, or you've gotten complaints about it. And it's usually, again, for the board, it's going to be usually your CEO, your fire chief. Somebody has a beef with that person, whether it's the board or somebody from the public. The board can go into executive session to talk about that thing, about that specific employee. It's not general employment policies. It's not, what should we do when complaints come in? It's more, somebody has a beef. We want to talk about it confidentially. For the employee's sake, it makes sense that there be executive session authority to do that confidentially, and that's what that's getting at. This is also if you think you're going to have to fire this person, and the board needs to go into executive session to talk about that. That's what that authority is there for. And there's a caveat there, but let me talk about the second one, which has the same caveat. The second bullet point there is separate executive session authority to just do a performance review. It could be that you love this person. It isn't that you have beef with them. It's that you like them and you want to be able to evaluate their employment and speak candidly with them. The board can do that in executive session under this authority. So the first one is for if somebody's got beef. The second one is just your run-of-the-mill evaluation. Okay, in both of those situations, however, notice that the employee, whoever it is you're talking about, has the right to ask that meeting not be held in executive session, that it be held in open session instead, which strongly implies that the individual you're talking about has to know that you guys are going to go into executive session to talk about them. So there should be enough notice in advance, Manager Bob, the board plans an executive session on, March 12th to discuss your employment, and you're going to tell them what the authority is. You don't necessarily have to say we intend to fire you. Usually they know that when they see it coming. But in either situation, you have to let the employee know. If the board wants to be able to do a performance evaluation of the fire chief, for example, in executive session, you can do that under that second bullet point. But you have to say, we would like to do your performance evaluation in executive session under this authority. You have the right to have it be done in open session. What do you think? And if the employee says, I want it done in open session, you must do it in open session. If the employee is fine with it in executive session, then you have it in executive session, but it always falls to the employee to make that call. I can tell you in practice, I've seen it go both ways. Usually if there isn't a lot of you know, if the relationship between the CEO and the board is good, and they just want to do an evaluation, both parties are fine with doing it in executive session, or they might be fine in doing it in open session, either way. Where I've seen it run into an interesting scenario is if, for example, the staff person knows that something's coming down the pike and they don't trust their board, they can ask that it be done in open session as well. And I've actually seen that work. I mean, saw an individual executive director who felt like there were members of the board who had it out for him, and he knew what his rights were, and he said, nope, we're going to do this in open session, and he did, and members of the public came and supported him and argued and objected and said, if you don't, you know, if you fire this guy, we're going to recall you. And then the alternative is that I've seen people get dragged through the dirt in open session, but they asked for it. So either of those is available to you. I saw the question come up, which is a good question, is must the employee be allowed to attend? And as a legal matter, well, if it's a public session, yes, because they can attend. If they say, I want this done in open session, they must be allowed to attend like any other member of the public would be. The interesting question comes up is the employee required to attend if you're doing it in executive session? And legally, no. Yeah, they are not. Now, there is a little bit of a caveat there is if your collective bargaining agreement, you know, if you have a union, the collective bargaining agreement will often require representation not only by the employee, but by a representative of the union. If that's true, then adhere to the collective bargaining agreement. If you don't have that, and this is just, you know, your regular workforce that's not unionized, legally speaking, the employee does not have to be included. Now, I don't recommend it. I'm not telling you to do it that way. I did have it come up once for me with a client where the employee knew that the board was not happy with him. He knew that they were going to be discussing either disciplining him or terminating him. He saw it coming. They gave him the notice because I was coaching them throughout. They gave him the notice. They said, here's when we intend to have our meeting, our executive session. And they told him that we'll be discussing your performance under this authority. You can have it done in open session. And the employee came back with, no, I want it done in executive session, but the date and time that you're talking about does not work for me. I need it done at a different date or time. I want to be able to bring my lawyer, yada, yada, yada. And the board asked me, like, do we have to listen to him? And the fact of the matter is no. I mean, this is an executive session of the board. If the board has the authority to do it and they properly noticed it, the employee does not necessarily have to be there. I don't recommend it again, but technically speaking, no, the employee does not have to be included, but they have to know that you're doing it. You can't just do it and not tell them. Okay. So all the prior three authorities are all separate authorities, but they're all related to employment. Okay. Any more questions about those three before we move on to the next one? Nothing?
Oh, no, we do have one from Tracy a little early on. We have public minutes stating that ES was held as required, though correct. Is audio recording only not sufficient?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Is the question, do we have to keep written minutes of the executive session? Is that really what the question is?
I believe so. They're just asking, is audio recording is only audio recording not sufficient
Okay.
enough?
Tracy says, yeah, that's the question. The question is, are they only allowed to do audio recording? The answer is no. You can audio, as with any public meeting, as long as you're keeping some kind of written minutes. It can be done by hand. It could be done by audio recording, digital recording, video recording. Any one of those is fine. So you can take written notes if you want to. You can take a recording and then do a transcript, you know, basically summarize it in writing. Both of those are valid written minutes or valid minutes of an executive session.
We do have a, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
We do have a couple of people with their hands raised. I believe they want to pop on and ask a question. So Greg, I saw us first. They wanted to ask their question live.
Okay, yay.
Thank you. Eileen, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. In fact, I can even see you. Hi, Greg.
Cool. It's the wonders of digital, but I prefer in person.
Oh, good.
Anyway,
I like it too.
I hate to back up, but I have another question about the executive session. We're in executive session properly noticed, and we're discussing a legal matter. And the only purpose of it being there is for our legal staff and our staff, you know how big it is, like not very big. About this litigation, we come out of executive session, you know, everybody's finished. So I close the executive session and we open back up into a regular session. And a member of the board starts asking questions about the information in executive session. Does that blow our privilege of that?
Potentially, depends. Asking the questions by itself, potentially. My thought is not necessarily. I guess what could though is how you deal with those questions. Again, this should fall to the board chair, or if it is the board chair doing this, it should fall to anybody else on the board to basically say, board member Mary, those are confidential questions. We're limited to what was discussed in executive session. Please, don't raise those during the public meeting, and basically smack down that person.
Okay.
Presumably, if you do that, you will not be giving away the farm. What the worst case scenario in that case is that you've tipped off the public to what, the nature of the conversation that was held. So I would say shut it down as quickly as you can without physically removing that person. But their potential is there. And so that's why it's always a good idea for the board chair when you convene the executive session is remind the board. They should know that, but they often don't. Like I said, they sometimes sort of forget, the lines can be blurred, especially if you're in the same room at just a, later time. So I would say just call them out on it and, as politely as you can and just say,
Okay, that's the way I handled it, but I just wanted to make sure. And now I've got a little bit more reinforcement. Thank you very much to make it happen. Thank you, Eileen.
You're very welcome. Another question?
I believe so. We had someone wanting to pop in, and that is Thad, I believe. You can
Yes.
you can unmute. Perfect.
Come on in, Thad.
Hello. So when talking about, say for your executive personnel management team, discussing wages or contracts with your executive employees, maybe it comes later, but could you touch on that if there's reason for executive session, and if you cover it later, that's fine.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'm trying to remember. I think in the full seminar I do touch on that, but I'll just touch on it now because you raised it and because we're talking about employment. That's a very good question, Thad, and I'm glad you raised it because it's very important. First of all, anything having to do with expenditures of public funds, including salaries, are not supposed to be discussed in executive session. Those are always supposed to be open session topics. So you could in executive session, I don't know, decide, what's an appropriate salary range. You could sort of theoretically talk about that, but in terms of what you're actually going to pay somebody or even salary negotiations would have to be done in open session. Now there are ways that can be very awkward and you can get around that. One of the things you might do if you need to negotiate salary is have the board reconvene the executive session, agree, vote on what the salary range will be, and then authorize somebody like the board chair or some other member to go and negotiate with the candidate to see if you can reach agreement or something like that. So you're not having to just kind of blather all that in public, but that's a very good question. So compensation, so compensation generally is not, you can't talk about that in executive session. Also, not for executive session, anything that sort of applies to all employees, it's basically a policy decision. It's not a specific employee that you're talking about. You're talking about a new benefit package or a new, salary schedule. You're talking about something that is basically a policy that will apply to employees. That is not executive session stuff. That has to be talked about in open session.
But the negotiation part of it could be one-on-one with a board rep and that prospective employee or your current employee, and then report back to the board in executive session and then make the decision in open or not?
Yeah, I can appreciate the little tap dance that you have to do here because you're right. It does have to be a bit of a tap dance. What you could do, what you would do that would be completely legit would be to, have your executive session, agree that, and preferably this has all been done ahead of time. You remember that if you're considering hiring somebody and you're in executive session to talk about hiring somebody, then remember your job description should have already been vetted to the public. Presumably the salary range has already been vetted to the public. The hiring procedures have already been vetted to the public. You've done all that transparency at the front end. And then at this point, you're interviewing people or deciding on candidates, or, you're going to be hiring somebody. And then, you in executive session, you all say, we really like, Fire Chief, Jane, we want to hire her. And here's our salary range. So you're gonna reconvene the meeting. You don't necessarily have to announce that you're going to hire Jane. What you would say is something like, going to reconvene the meeting, and you would say, the board hereby authorizes so-and-so, whoever it is you want to do that, whoever what you want to authorize. It could be two, like if you have a 5-member board, as long as it's not a majority. You could say, we're going to authorize, the board chair and the board secretary to meet with our preferred candidate and discuss salary, and then report back to the executive, report back to the board on the status or something like that. And then in terms of what happens, you could just, if it comes back that, Jane says, great, I agree to work for you. Thank you for the offer. We've agreed on salary, and it's all cut and dried. Then it could just be discussed in open session. There's no reason to do it in executive session at that point. But you could arguably go into executive session, have the negotiating team report back and say, Jane agrees that that she wants to come work for us, and she's agreed to the salary that we've proposed. So then they all say yay, and then you convene the open session, and then you announce, the board is pleased to announce that we intend to hire Jane as our fire chief, and here's the salary that she will be paid. So does that make sense?
Yeah, and I guess what I was specifically kind of looking for is ongoing negotiations, we'll say, with your current fire chief, and he wants more money or more time off or whatever that looks like. What permissible reason under executive session could we quote to do those discussions with them, and then make a public disclosure saying, we've talked about it, this is what we're willing to do, and then go back into to make a formal board decision?
Yeah, good question. And you're threading the needle a bit there because you kind of have to, and I get that.
Sorry.
No, and it's very good. I mean, as you can see, sometimes there just aren't bright lines, and I know that what we want to be able to say we did is engage in substantial compliance with the law. Okay, the purity test may not apply here. What I would recommend in that situation is don't have the entire board do the negotiating. Authorize somebody to go do that. Have the negotiation happen outside of a board meeting, because you can reach agreement that way. If the board has authorized somebody to negotiate that with this person, then that can easily be done outside of a public meeting. And then ultimately you could come back to an executive session and report to the board. Bob has agreed to the salary, you could even say has agreed to X amount of dollars, and you could do that in executive session. And then you reconvene the open session and say, Bob has agreed to a salary increase of X, and you announce that in open session.
And
so
would the permissible reason be for the second bullet item on this one?
The executive session authority.
Like
Yeah,
if you state a statute.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Is if it isn't discussing it is technically a performance question. So yeah, I would say
Okay.
yes. Because
That's
presumably,
what we've used. I'm just trying to dot our i's.
yeah, that's the one you would use. And procedurally, I think anytime that you get the entire board involved, you are dancing with a potentially illegal executive session if you're using that to talk about salary. So to be clean about it, authorize somebody to do that on behalf of the board, and then come back and do it that way. Does that help?
Yes.
All right.
As much as it can be helpful, you know.
I
That
know.
is the one that's
And again, the
murky.
law is what it is, but it can't address every scenario. We just kind of have to do what we do the best you can. Intent goes a long way in trying to defend you. If you tried to
And then-
deflect the law and you didn't.
Right. And that was the other reason, because the one you show up here was the other one that we've talked about.
Okay. All right. Okay. Any more questions on the stuff we've already talked about before we finish up these exemptions?
I believe you are good.
Okay, thanks, Christian. Okay, the rest of these, again, are not going to come up very often. The employment stuff tends to come up often, and we're going to talk about legal stuff in a minute. The board can meet in executive session to talk about whoever is negotiating your labor contract for you. It doesn't mean you have negotiations in executive session. What it means is that you can have a confidential conversation with your representative, whoever's arguing on your behalf on management side. You can talk with that person in executive session because, there's value in making sure that you aren't giving away the farm. Similarly, the board can meet in executive session with someone who is negotiating a real estate transaction for you. You're going to buy property, you're going to sell property. There are good reasons, good market reasons to have those conversations held privately, like we're willing to go up this high. You can meet with whoever's negotiating on your behalf in executive session. And then authorize, then they're going to go off and, continue the negotiation, presumably. Similarly, if you're talking about public investments, I've never seen this come up with my clients. Maybe it comes up more often with large, like cities and counties and stuff, but most special districts don't tend to have a lot of chat about their public investments. But just so you know, you can discuss with your negotiator that as well. Now, these next two are somewhat related, but they are two separate authorities, and they both have to do with legal matters. And I want to make some important distinctions between the two. Let me talk about the second one first, because that's often most helpful. The board can meet in executive session to consult with counsel concerning the legal rights and duties of a public body with regard to current litigation or litigation likely to be filed. This is the attorney-client privilege with respect to litigation. That's why this is confidential. What this means is that, the board has been sued, or the board is suing somebody, and you are engaged in active litigation, or litigation is imminent. Like you've been served with a tort claim notice and darn it, a lawsuit is coming down the pike for you. What the authority does is allow you to meet with your lawyer or lawyers to talk about that litigation in executive session. You can only talk about the litigation. That's what it's there for. Okay, so that one is pretty easy to understand. So I often get the question from my clients, well, we have this, we just want to talk about potential liabilities, or we muffed up and we haven't been sued yet, but we think we might be. Then that second bullet point does not apply to that situation because there's not litigation filed or likely to be filed. But you can meet in executive session to talk about it if, and that gets us back to the first bullet, have your lawyer give you something in writing, because written communications from your lawyer are also subject to attorney-client privilege and are confidential and are not required to be disclosed. So that exemption, that top one is you can meet in executive session to consider information or records that are exempt by law from public inspection. Meaning anything confidential. The board can meet in executive session to talk about legit confidential information. Could be an something employment related, could be a trade secret, it could be, whatever is protected by law, but that includes attorney-client privilege documents, okay? Because it is protected by attorney-client privilege, you can use the first authority to go into executive session to talk about it as long as your conversation is limited to what is included in the written document. I do this often for my clients, like they have a question that implies a bunch of legal stuff and they want an opinion, or they want some guidance, or they want an orientation, like what are the pros, what are the cons legally, and I write something for them, whether it's a letter or a memorandum, something like that, and I give it to them. They can talk about that in executive session, completely legit to do that. The lawyer does not necessarily have to be there. the writing has to be there. Sometimes we'll do both. Sometimes I'll be there, we'll talk about it, and they'll ask me questions about it during executive session. All of that is fine. So that if you have a legal issue that you want to be able to confer with your lawyer about, and it is not litigation, you can do it, but just ask your lawyer to provide you something in writing, and then you can talk about it in that way. Okay, there is no kind of catch-all meet with our lawyer. There just isn't one. Okay, so again, authorize somebody to go meet with the lawyer if you need to do that. But if the board wants to do it collectively, these are the only two options available for you. All right, if you are discussing information about or reviewing approval of programs related to security of. So what this is getting at is if you are having conversations about how to maintain security of our public infrastructure, and they're all listed there: electricity, gas, hazardous substances, petroleum products, sewage, water, etc. If you're listed there and the reason why you want to meet is to talk about the security programs for this stuff, or a potential breach of this stuff, or somebody did breach this stuff, there is executive session authority to talk about it, because there is a public safety component to not telling everybody how to compromise your system, or that the system has been compromised. And essentially it's there to kind of, the terrorist protection. Like if somebody's threatening to, interrupt your electricity grid, the board can go into executive session to talk about the security of the electricity grid. And there's good public policy reasons to keep that confidential. And that's it. If you don't see it in that list, it's highly likely you cannot do it. All right. So be very, very careful when you think you can call an executive session. Make sure it's properly authorized. In terms of penalties, if you fail to comply with executive session laws, that is an ethics violation, and it is personal to the public official. So every single board member is personally liable for potential violations of executive session laws. There is a fine under the ethics laws of up to $1,000 per violation. All right. So if you're doing it a lot, that could be a potential exposure. And remember, your special district cannot pay your fines for you. If you violate ethics laws, your insurance company will not do it, and your district cannot do it. All right. So it's going to come out of your pocket. So each individual has to be careful that you're following the law. That violation the fine can be excused, not the violation, but the fine can be excused if what you did is you went into executive session because your lawyer said you could, and it turned out the lawyer was wrong. It's still a violation, but the fine will be waived. I mean, you may have a claim against your lawyer at that point, but what the law is trying to get you to do is get advice ahead of time. Protect yourselves by making sure you're doing it correctly, and you can avoid the potential liability for that. Okay. Oh, this is actually this is a public meetings thing, but it does not apply to executive sessions. This was a recent change in the law, which came out of our COVID, the changes in the legislation with respect to COVID. You are now required to provide remote access, if it's feasible, to the extent reasonably possible, to your public meetings, but note that executive sessions are excluded. So for your regular public meetings, you're supposed to, if you can, allow people the opportunity to listen in. It could be by telephone, could be live streaming, could be however you do it, by Zoom. People just have to be able to listen in on your meeting, but the executive sessions are exempt from that. So you don't have to let the public attend your executive session in that way. Okay. All right, we don't have a lot of time left, and I want to get through a few sort of scenarios to sort of practice this stuff. Are there any questions about the substance that we've already talked about?
None that I'm seeing in the chat.
Okay, don't see any hands raised. Okay, what we've done here, I did this once live and it was a lot of fun. It would have been more fun if we could have done it live, but I think it'll still be fun. What I did is prepare a variety of certain scenarios to sort of test our knowledge and practice this stuff in real time. Ordinarily, I would take volunteers from the audience, but since that can be a little clumsy in this format, what the Valiant SDAO staff have volunteered to be our players here. I'm going to introduce the scenario. I'll explain to you who the players are, and then they're going to go through a script. Okay, and at the end, we're going to talk about it. All right, these are not long, so hang in there. All right, is our cast members ready? If you're not ready, say I'm not ready. Otherwise, I'll assume you're ready. Okay. All right, let's start with scenario one. in this scenario, we have one board chair. Remember, this is a meeting of the board, one board chair, 3 board members. Okay. All right. Board chair, take it away.
The regular meeting of the Metric Gastric Spastic District will now come to order. First, are there any changes to the agenda?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I would like to add an agenda item. I would like to hold an executive session under ORS 192660 subsection 2B to discuss some complaints I've heard about Manager Bob.
Well, that's concerning. Sounds like an executive session is a good idea. Can I have a motion on adding an executive session to our agenda under ORS 192.660 subsection 2B to discuss complaints against Manager Bob?
So moved.
Is there a second?
I second the motion.
Is there any discussion?
Yes, I have a question. Does the manager know you want to discuss these complaints in executive session?
Of course not. We should discuss this in private so we can decide whether discipline is appropriate before we talk with him.
I don't think we can have this executive session.
Okay, question for the class. I'm not sure how you respond to this, but you can unmute yourself and we'll do a voice conversation if you want to. Board member 3 says she doesn't think we can have this executive session. Is she right?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Good for you. Is there anybody think otherwise?
Is Bob sitting in the room? He just got notified.
Okay, are you a firefighter by any chance?
I'm on a fire board.
Okay, all right. That explains a lot. Okay. Those who have responded, the majority, and I'll get to your question in a minute, the majority believe correctly that this would be an improper executive session because presumably Bob has not been notified. All right. And remember, this is a discussion of Bob's performance. There is authority to do that, but he has the right to ask that be done in open session instead. Now, good question, good threading the needle question. What if he's sitting right there? Can you talk about him in that context? Arguably, yes, because he's been notified and he could say, well, hold on, I don't want, no, we're going to do this in open session. He has the ability to do that and he should be notified of that. The tricky part there is that you have not given proper notice of the meeting. All right. Arguably, you can go into executive session in the moment if you have an immediate need to do that. So depending on what it is Bob did, again, if he's committed a crime or he's, hit someone or something horrible is going on, arguably you could announce it, ask Bob, hey, Bob, are you cool with executive session to talk about you? And Bob could say, sure, great, let's go into executive session to talk about me. The board could do that could announce it for the minutes and go into executive session right there. However, remember, you've missed the public notice piece of this, which potentially could make your meeting suspect. The appropriate thing to do, which you probably all have figured out already, is unless it's an emergency, what you should do is say, no, we won't have the executive session now. Does the board agree we will notify Bob and have an executive session on such other date, under the authority, whatever the authority is, and hold it then. That would be the appropriate way to clean that up and make sure you did it correctly. And you're going to send out notice and do it the way you should be. And again, Bob will be notified, and now he has even more notice that you're going to talk about him. So that'll be fun. Okay. How much time have we got? We got about 10 minutes. Scenario 2. We have 1 board chair and 2 board members for this one. Mr. Board Chair, take it away.
All right. Well, this concludes the regular meeting of the board will now go into executive session to discuss real estate negotiations with our agent pursuant to.
I'm sorry, Mr. Board Chair. Will you cut out for a minute there? What's the name of your district?
Oh, this is the Dipstick Downtick Dimwit District.
Okay, all right, go ahead.
As noted in our agenda, the board will now go into executive session to discuss real estate negotiations with our agent pursuant to 192.660 subsection 2.3. Our real estate agent is invited to stay. The media is invited to attend, but is reminded not to report on anything discussed in the executive session. All other members of the public are excused. The board will reconvene at our next regular meeting on February 7th to announce any final decisions.
Public leaves.
Mr. Chair, I'm so glad that the district is interested in buying the piece of land that I own on 4th Street. I think we can reach a fair deal.
Wait. Mr. Chair, with all due respect to board member number 1, shouldn't board member number 1 be excused from this session?
Why? I declared a conflict of interest at the last meeting, and I don't plan to vote on the final decision. I shouldn't have to leave.
So the question is, which board member is correct and why? This would be an interesting conversation in real time, but since we don't have that option, the issue that's being raised here is we talked about the fact that the board chair can decide who gets to attend the executive session. Under almost all circumstances, the entirety of the board attends, right? That's who it's there for. This raises an interesting fact scenario in that you have a board member here, you have the properly called executive session, the board chair called it properly. You have the authority to discuss real estate transactions in executive session and meet with your negotiator. In this scenario, one of the board members in the room, this is her land. So this brings in, if you're familiar at all with ethics for public officials, the board member number 2, or I'm sorry, whichever board member owns the land, has a direct and actual conflict of interest. This is the one scenario, very rare scenario, where I would strongly recommend that the board chair, the board member who owns the land, recuse herself from this conversation and physically leave the room. Ordinarily, under conflicts of interest, you don't have to leave the room. In this case, I would recommend it. Can the board insist on it? Probably not. But this would be a situation where it would be a really good idea because the board wants to talk about it confidentially. And the whole reason you're talking about it confidentially is to not tip your hand to the other side on, the deal you want to make here. So that's just a little bit of a red herring in there. That's actually an ethics question, but it implicates public meetings as well, or executive sessions as well. Okay, scenario 3, we have 1 board chair, 2 board members, and 1 reporter. Go.
I now convene the executive session of the Mr. Mystic District to discuss litigation filed or likely to be filed pursuant to ORS 192-660 subsection 2H, as stated in our meeting notice. Our attorney is invited to stay. The media is invited to attend, but is reminded not to report on anything discussed in the executive session. All other members of the public are excused. The board will reconvene at our next regular meeting on February 7th to announce any final decisions. Public leaves.
Mr. Chair, while our lawyer is here, after we talk about the litigation matter, can we have a confidential discussion about the agreement we are planning to sign with Parts supplier? I have some legal questions.
Discussion ensues about the litigation and also about the terms of the contract with Parts. The meeting ends.
Newspaper reporter Pat, I'm so glad that none of this information will appear in the newspaper. It's so important to keep these legal matters private.
Oh, I definitely won't report on the litigation, but our readers will be very interested in the Parts contract. That will probably make tomorrow's edition.
Can reporter Pat do this? Can reporter Pat report on the Parts contract? Yes or no?
Yes.
Anybody?
No.
Here's some no's.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. No.
No.
Okay, I heard some yeses and some no's. For those of you who said yes, you are correct. And I'm guessing those of you who said yes know why, and I would ordinarily have you volunteer that. But I can tell you that the reason why the newspaper reporter can report on the Parts contract is because the board did not have proper authority to go into executive session to talk about the Parts contract with their lawyer. They can meet with their lawyer to talk about the litigation, and they gave the proper site for that. But while we're all here and our lawyers in the room, once they start talking about something else that is not litigation, they do not have the authority to do it in that situation. So fair game for the reporter to report on topics that are not properly authorized in executive session. Okay, that's what that lesson there is for. All right, final scenario. This is gonna be perfect in terms of timing. We have one board chair, 4 board members. Go.
Thank you, board members, for attending this executive session to discuss our attorney's confidential memo advising us on what to do about the bridge we own, London Bridge, which, to everybody's surprise, is falling down. I think we need to move ahead with the recommended reconstruction plan. Can I move to have a motion to initiate the plan?
I move that we go forward with the reconstruction plan recommended by our attorney in a confidential memorandum that we reviewed tonight.
I'll second that motion.
Is there any discussion? Well, hearing none, all in favor of approving the construction plan to keep London Bridge from falling down, say aye.
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 Those opposed? Hearing none, the motion passes unanimously.
Was this the proper way to approve the reconstruction plan for London Bridge?
No.
No.
No. No.
No.
Nope. Can't make motions in executive session.
No.
Very good, Heather. You're exactly right. You could make a motion. I mean, you could make it, but you're picking up on the fact that what they did is vote in executive session. And they're not supposed to do that, but even if they did do that, it's not binding. All right, they have to reconvene the open session in order to take a vote. So that was the step that they missed. So good catch for those of you who said no. All right, final scenario. One board chair, 4 board members.
Thank you, board members, for attending this executive session I called last night. The bond measure we're planning to put on the ballot is so controversial that I thought it would be best to have a discussion in private so we don't get yelled at like we were last time.
Board member 1.
Sorry. I agree. I didn't sign up for this job just to be treated so disrespectfully. We're not getting paid for this, you know?
Absolutely, you're right. If I can't be loved by everyone all the time, I don't see the point in doing this at all.
We should have a lot more executive sessions. Our jobs would be so much easier if we didn't listen to public opinion all the time.
Well,
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. We're the
Whoa.
board. We
Whoa.
get to decide.
You're taking my part.
Oh, it was yellow. Sorry.
Exactly. We're the board, so we get to decide when we don't want the public involved in our business. What is anyone going to do about it anyway? It's not like we're breaking any laws.
Is this the proper executive session?
No. No.
No.
I'd like to know if there's anyone in the room who says yes. Someone's saying no timely public notice, which presumably is true because he called it last night. That's a good catch. The other glaringly obvious issue is that this is a situation of a board who doesn't understand the point of executive sessions and that they have to be properly authorized. You don't get to just convene it because it feels better to have confidential conversations. You have to have the proper statutory authority to do it, or it is an illegal executive session. And yes, you are breaking laws, and each individual board member is potentially personally liable for not complying with executive session requirements. Okay, my clock says we are 1 minute and 9 seconds over time. I think that is amazing. And thank you to all of our staff who have, all of the SDAO staff who came in the last minute to help us with our role playing. Thank you so much. The question about whether the slides will be available, I'll punt that to if anybody on the SDAO staff knows how they can get the slides. They were part of the conference materials, the annual conference materials. So if you have access to those, this was supposed to have been done then, and for technical reasons did not happen. But so they are available there. And my recommendation, unless the staff says otherwise, is you can probably get them from SDAO.
Yeah, actually, I was just gonna mention the same thing, Eileen. Since it was a conference session, the handouts will be available on this conference site. But if you don't have access to that for whatever reason, you can email memberservices@sdao.com and we'll share that with you.
Excellent. Thanks, Jennifer. We're getting lots of thank yous. You're very, very welcome. Thank you for coming back, for not giving up on us because we couldn't get it done during the annual conference. And thanks for everybody who asked questions and attended. I appreciate it.